She was only 15, and yet, that night, the entire fate of the Ottoman Empire began to shift around her. For most of the world, she was nothing more than a concubine brought from distant lands. A gift, a symbol, a girl meant to vanish into the hundreds of women locked behind the golden gates of Topkapi Palace. But Hurrem, she never agreed to vanish. And on the night she entered Sultan Suleiman's private chambers for the very first time, she stepped into a destiny far darker and far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. But before we take you inside the most dangerous walls of the Ottoman court, welcome to the History Veil. Here, we uncover the forgotten truths, the political betrayals, and the hidden decisions that changed empires forever. If you want more untold stories just like this one, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the History Veil, so you never miss what history tried to bury. Hurrem's story did not begin in silk. It began in ashes. She arrived in Constantinople after surviving captivity, war, and the brutal machinery of empire building. The women around her believed she would break just like the thousands before her. But Hurrem didn't break. She watched. She learned. She understood the rhythm of the palace, the whispers of its corridors, the cold calculations behind every smile. And she understood one truth. In a place where every woman could be replaced, only one thing brought true safety: power and power. In this world was held by one man, Suleiman. The harem was restless that evening. Servants moved quickly, their whispers sharp, carrying rumors that something unusual was happening. A young girl, one with foreign eyes and fearless silence, had been chosen to be presented before the Sultan. Many envied her, many hated her, and many feared what this meant, because in Topkapi, nothing happened by coincidence. Hurrem was bathed, dressed, adorned with fabrics that shimmered under candlelight. Her hair was braided with gold threads, her wrists circled with warm metal. Her heart beat steady even as the women around her trembled for her. She wasn't afraid. She had been through worse. Darkness, hunger, uncertainties. These had shaped her long before palace silk touched her skin. And now, she was being led to the most powerful man in the empire. The corridors were silent as she walked, guarded by eunuchs who revealed nothing in their eyes. Behind every gate she passed, another layer of the world closed around her. Outside those walls, an empire stretched from Hungary to Baghdad. Inside, a single decision could cost a woman her life. When the final gate opened, the scent of incense blanketed the air. Hurrem stepped into a chamber lit by hundreds of lamps, each flame dancing against marble and shadow. The room felt alive, heavy with the presence of history, heavy with the presence of the Sultan himself. Suleiman didn't look at her immediately. That was the game. Power never rushed. Power made others wait. Hurrem stood still, shoulders straight, refusing to shrink into fear the way so many before her had. She didn't look away. She didn't stumble. She didn't bow too deeply. She simply existed with a quiet defiance that broke every rule of the palace. And that more than beauty, more than training, more than silk was what caught his attention. He finally looked at her, and for a moment the air shifted. Not with romance, not with warmth, but with recognition. This one was different. The court had presented hundreds of women to Suleiman before. None mattered, none lasted, none changed anything. They were temporary shadows in a world ruled by men. But Hurrem's presence felt like a fracturer. Small crack in a structure that had stood untouched for centuries. A girl who did not tremble. A girl who did not lower her gaze. A girl who carried a storm in her silence. This was the moment every woman in the harem dreamed of. And the moment every woman in the harem feared. Because if Hurrem made an impression tonight, everything inside these walls would change alliances, loyalties, futures, lives. The attendants withdrew quietly, shutting the giant doors behind them. Hurrem was now completely alone with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Outside, the palace continued breathing in its slow, ancient rhythm. But inside that chamber, history was shifting, quietly, dangerously, permanently. No one knew it yet. But this night would mark the beginning of a political earthquake that would shake the empire to its core, redefine royal power, ignite rivalries, and set Hurrem on a path that no concubine had ever walked before. The girl who arrived as a captive was about to become the most powerful woman the Ottoman dynasty had ever seen, and the empire would never recover from the choice Suleiman made this night. When the doors finally closed behind Hurrem, the palace outside continued breathing in its slow, ancient rhythm. But inside that chamber, something far more dangerous was forming. Hurrem did not speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was deliberate, controlled, and sharper than any blade in the palace. Suleiman watched her the way a strategist studies. A battlefield measuring, calculating, sensing that the girl standing before him was not like the hundreds the court had placed at his feet. For most in the harem, entering this room meant surrender. But for Hurrem, it meant stepping into the center of an empire that had already stolen everything from her. And if this empire believed she would bow the way others had, it was wrong. The room was quiet, filled only with the gentle crackle of oil lamps burning along polished marble. Suleiman dismissed Protokov that night. He didn't demand rehearsed verses or forced gestures. He wanted to observe her as she truly was, unfiltered, unshaken, unbroken. And Hurrem understood the importance of the moment so clearly that she breathed as if each breath were a piece of strategy. He asked her where she came from. She answered, but without fear. Her past was a weight she carried, but not one that bent her. And the absence of trembling, the absence of weakness, it startled him more than beauty ever could. The palace walls were not made of stone alone. They were built from centuries of silence. Women spoke only when asked. They survived by becoming invisible. Hurrem broke that rule simply by existing with confidence. And confidence, in a place where survival required obedience, was the greatest rebellion of all. By the time she left the Sultan's chamber that night, the servants waiting outside sensed something had shifted. Their eyes tracked her quietly, trying to read any sign, fear, pride, shame. But Hurrem walked with a calm they had never seen in a girl taken from foreign lands. She did not tremble. She did not hide. She carried herself like someone who had just stepped onto a much larger path. When she returned to the harem, whispers spread instantly. Women who once ignored her now stared with sharp, suspicious eyes. Those who had mocked her now measured her carefully. And those who held power inside those walls felt a flicker of fear. Because in a world ruled by jealousy and silent wars, the greatest threat was not beauty, it was attention. And Hurrem had just captured the attention of the most powerful man in the empire. But attention in this palace was a double-edged sword. It brought opportunity. It also brought enemies. And Hurrem was about to meet the first of many. Mahidevran, the Sultan's favored companion for years. Mother to his son. A woman whose position had been unchallenged, until now. The moment Mahidevran heard Hurrem's name carried through the corridors, something hardened inside her. She had risen through charm, loyalty, and political instinct. But she knew how fragile influence could be. A single shift in the Sultan's gaze could change years of stability. And even though she tried to hide it, she felt the beginning of a cold, familiar emotion threat. That night, Mahidevran watched Hurrem from a distance. Hurrem didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the pressure rising around her like a storm, but she had survived storms far worse. The harem was not a place of friendship. It was a battlefield disguised with silk. Alliances were forged in shadows, rivalries whispered in corners, and every gesture, every glance was a weapon.
Hurrem said nothing. That was her brilliance. While others talked, she observed. While others panicked, she studied. She noticed who whispered when she passed, who avoided eye contact, who glared too long. She watched the hierarchy, the movements of servants, the habits of eunuchs, the rivalries between the older women. She learned the rhythm of the harem faster than anyone expected, and it didn't take long before news reached the highest levels of the palace. The Sultan had asked for Hurrem again. Not once. Twice. Then a third time. In a place where thousands of women spent their entire lives waiting for a single summons, this was unheard of. Mahidevran felt it immediately. Her influence had begun to erode. The harem was shifting. The court was whispering. And Suleiman, the man whose attention determined the fate of every woman behind those walls, was breaking a centuries-old pattern by choosing a girl with no royal lineage, no alliances, no past. A girl brought in chains. Even the Grand Vizier heard the rumors. Even the imperial consorts heard the murmurs. Even the palace guards, trained to remain silent, noticed the change in movement from one wing of the palace to another. And in the shadows of the harem, a new kind of fear grew, because if a foreign slave could rise this quickly, then no one's position was truly safe. Hurrem, meanwhile, said nothing. She remained quiet, calm, almost invisible. But beneath that collected silence was something far stronger than ambition, purpose. She had already lost her family, her homeland, her past. She would not lose her future. And in a palace built on silence, her determination echoed louder than any voice. By the end of that week, the palace had split into two groups, those who believed Hurrem's rise was temporary, and those who sensed the beginning of something far larger, far more dangerous. Because for the first time in decades, the Sultan was not just choosing a companion. He was making a decision that would shape the empire. And Hurrem had just taken her first step toward rewriting Ottoman history forever. By the time Hurrem's name reached the deeper layers of the palace, the whispers had already grown sharp enough to cut. Some women dismissed her rise as a passing distraction, a fleeting spark that would burn out the moment a new girl arrived. But the ones who understood power, the ones who had survived years inside these walls, knew better. They watched the pattern of the palace shift with cautious eyes. And they realized something terrifying. Suleiman wasn't acting out of curiosity. He was acting out of interest. Consistent interest. The kind that changed fates. The harem had its own laws. Unwritten. Unspoken. But absolute. And one of these laws was simple. No woman summoned more than twice in a week unless she was being positioned for something larger. Something dangerous. Something that could tilt the internal balance of the empire. Hurrem had already crossed that threshold. She wasn't just catching attention, she was holding it. And that was a threat the palace wasn't built to handle quietly. The chief eunuchs noticed it first. Their job wasn't just protection, it was surveillance. They were the eyes and ears of the palace, trained to track behavior changes in both the women and the Sultan himself. And over the last few days, they had noticed subtle differences in Suleiman's tone, his requests, the timing of his summons. They recognized the signs, even if the court pretended not to. A storm was forming, and Hurrem was at the center of it. Mahidevran felt it most personally. She had held her place beside Suleiman for years, not through force, but through familiarity, a soft presence in his life, a mother to his son, a bridge between him and the stability of the harem. But the moment she heard Hurrem's name spoken with growing frequency, something inside her cracked. She wasn't afraid of Hurrem herself. She was afraid of losing a position that took years to protect. A position the harem would destroy her for if she slipped. In the evenings, she sat with her ladies-in-waiting, trying to hide the quiet panic building in her voice. But even they could see it. Power didn't just live in a throne room. It lived in the spaces between people, the glances, the whispers, the subtle changes in tone. And Mahidevran sensed that those spaces were tightening around her like a closing fist. Meanwhile, Hurrem moved like a shadow that refused to stay in darkness. She didn't posture. She didn't challenge. She simply existed with a confidence that the palace could not categorize. And that made her unpredictable. The most dangerous quality in a place designed to control every outcome. Suleiman summoned her yet again, this time not for conversation, but for observation. He wanted to understand her mind, her reactions, the way she absorbed the palace's chaos without flinching. He asked questions about her past, and while she didn't reveal everything, the strength in her answers astonished him. Not because she shared pain, but because she did not let pain define her. Her composure wasn't a shield. It was a weapon. Word of these conversations spread quickly. The older women, those who carried decades of palace memory, understood the implications immediately. They had seen similar rises before, brief flames that flickered bright, then vanished into punishment or exile. But something about Hurrem was different. She wasn't rising by luck or circumstance. She was rising with intention. And intention inside a palace like this was enough to rewrite destinies. Rumors now traveled beyond the harem walls into the administrative wing of Topkapi. Advisors whispered to each other in cautious tones. Some dismissed her as an inexperienced girl still intoxicated by attention. Others warned that the Sultan was revealing a growing bond, a dangerous sign in a world where emotions were expected to remain secondary to strategy. A Sultan who began to care was a Sultan who could be influenced. And an influenced ruler made powerful enemies nervous. Hurrem sensed the shift before anyone said a word. She had lived through captivity and war, she knew how to read the air. And the air around her was tightening, filled with silent calculations and glances that lingered just a moment too long. But she didn't shrink. She didn't break into fear. If anything, she steadied herself, understanding that she was no longer just surviving the palace, she was becoming part of its story. Late one night, as she sat beside the lattice windows, she looked out over the palace courtyards. The moon cast patterned shadows through the carved screens, falling across her face like fragments of a past she couldn't erase. But instead of mourning what she lost, she began to focus on what she could build. Hurrem was no longer thinking like a captive or a concubine. She was thinking like someone standing at the doorway of power. And she was deciding whether to walk through. She didn't know it yet, but others were making that decision for her. Plans were being formed. Alliances were shifting. Mahidevran had already begun meeting secretly with influential women to protect her position. Eunuchs whispered about Hurrem's rise to those who controlled the deeper operations of the palace. And in the vast silence of Topkapi, forces were gathering, some hoping to lift Hurrem higher, others waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy her. But for now, the palace held its breath, watching a girl from distant lands rise with a calm the empire could not explain. What began as a simple presentation to the Sultan was transforming into something else entirely, something larger than the harem, larger than the palace, something that would shape the very future of Suleiman's reign. And Hurrem, still unaware of the scale of the storm around her, continued moving forward with the same silent determination that had carried her through every cage she had ever known. The palace had begun to shift in ways most people couldn't see, but those who lived inside its walls felt every change like a tremor beneath their feet. For weeks, Hurrem's name had moved quietly through the corridors, carried in whispers, passed through the hands of attendants, slipped into the ears of those who understood how fragile power truly was. But now, her name wasn't whispering anymore. It was echoing. And echoes inside Topkapi didn't fade, they grew. Mahidevran sensed it changing around her like a cold wind creeping under a closed door. What started as uncertainty had now become an unspoken warning. Every servant who hesitated before addressing her, every unfamiliar glance exchanged among the women, every slight delay in receiving information, these tiny fractures formed a pattern she recognized all too well. A shift in hierarchy. A slow unraveling. A threat she could no longer ignore. She was no longer the unquestioned presence beside the Sultan. She was becoming the memory of stability, replaced by something new, something uncalculated, something that frightened the people who lived on predictions. Hurrem was rewriting the pace of the harem, and Mahidevran could feel herself being pushed toward a place she had spent years avoiding. A place where influence fades into silence, but Mahidevran was not ready to surrender anything. She met with the older, more experienced women of the palace, those who once guided her through the labyrinth of politics. Their eyes told her what their words would not. They had seen similar rises before. Some ended quickly. Some ended violently. And some changed everything. None of them dared say which path Hurrem's rise resembled. Meanwhile, Suleiman himself was changing in small, almost imperceptible ways. His decisions grew sharper. His attention more focused. His routines shifted in patterns that only the palace staff would ever notice. Hurrem's presence had entered his mind, not as a distraction, but as a subject of curiosity. And curiosity in a ruler like Suleiman was a force that could shape the empire. But he began asking for reports about the harem, not out of suspicion, but out of interest in the atmosphere shifting around Hurrem. He requested additional attendance in her wing. He asked questions about her background, her behavior, her interactions. And every answer he received only deepened his interest. She wasn't blending into the palace like she was supposed to. She was becoming a point of focus. Even the administrative side of Topkapi had begun considering what this meant. Advisors spoke in cautious, layered language. They never addressed Hurrem directly, but they danced around her existence, analyzing how the Sultan's changing behavior might affect long-term decisions, alliances, appointments, future political marriages. A foreign-born girl rising inside the palace hierarchy was not just unusual, it was historically unprecedented. The Valide Sultan, mother of Suleiman, noticed the shift as well. She had lived long enough to know the difference between temporary attention and emerging influence. And Hurrem's name had begun floating through spaces where temporary names did not survive. She didn't oppose Hurrem immediately, she was smarter than that. Instead, she observed. She studied. She evaluated a girl who had walked into the Sultan's chambers without trembling. A girl who had not folded under the pressure of palace expectations. But even she couldn't deny the consequence of Hurrem's rise. The palace was dividing into small, invisible camps. Not openly, not dramatically, quietly, the way empires shift before they collapse or transform. Servants aligned themselves based on instinct. Advisors formed opinions based on loyalty. Women in the harem positioned themselves either beside Mahidevran's long-standing authority, or the possibility of Hurrem's future one. And Hurrem herself? She moved through these changes without forcing anything. She didn't command attention. She didn't seek allies. She barely spoke at all. Her silence forced others to interpret her intentions. Some believed she wanted power, others believed she wanted safety, and a few saw something else entirely. Not ambition. Strategy. A silent strategy crafted by someone who understood that survival was not given, it was constructed. Late one evening, Mahidevran crossed paths with Hurrem for the first time since the tension had begun to rise. The encounter was brief, silent, and carefully measured. Hurrem lowered her eyes respectfully, not out of fear, but out of the palace etiquette she had already mastered. Mahidevran acknowledged her with a controlled expression, every movement precise and restrained. They exchanged no words, but the palace felt the shift in the air, the beginning of a rivalry that would shape the next decade of Ottoman history. As Hurrem continued through the corridor, the patterned shadows from the lanterns moved across her face like carved pieces of destiny settling into place. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She didn't need to. She had already understood the truth long before anyone else admitted it. The palace was not opposing her because she was weak. It was opposing her because she was rising. And the empire had no idea how high she was going to climb. The deeper Hurrem's name traveled into the palace, the more the foundations of power shifted beneath everyone's feet. For years, the hierarchy inside Topkapi had remained untouched, predictable, balanced, almost comfortable in its routine. But now that balance was cracking. Every corner of the palace, from the harem to the council chambers, felt the pressure of something new rising, a force no one could stop, and no one fully understood. Suleiman had begun asking for Hurrem more frequently than the traditions allowed. What once seemed like simple interest was turning into consistency. And consistency in the Sultan's attention was not merely affection. It was influence. It was disruption. It was the spark that set the palace on edge. The older women who had managed the harem for decades gathered quietly. They studied the situation with the experience of survivors, women who had watched dozens rise and fall. They knew how fragile stability was inside these walls. They knew how dangerous a single shift could be. And they knew that Hurrem's steady climb could not continue without consequences. Yet no one understood how she was rising so effortlessly. She wasn't born into privilege. She didn't have allies. She wasn't protected by a powerful family. She had come from a place that the empire itself barely acknowledged. But every time the palace expected her to break, she remained steady. Every challenge she faced only seemed to sharpen her presence. Every attempt to intimidate her only revealed more strength. In the administrative wing, advisors worried quietly. A foreign-born consort gaining this level of proximity to the Sultan carried political implications. Alliances with other empires depended on marriage strategies. Internal diplomacy depended on stability. And here was a girl whose rise could change the future structure of the dynasty entirely. The palace astrologers and scholars even began receiving quiet inquiries. Whenever a ruler changed his patterns, the empire looked for signs, omens, timings, symbols. They whispered about the possibility that Hurrem's arrival marked the beginning of a new cycle. Some believed it was a blessing. Others feared it. But everyone felt it. Meanwhile, within the harem walls, Hurrem walked through shifting tides with the same unwavering calm she carried from the moment she entered the palace. She understood now what the palace feared most. Not beauty, not competition, but unpredictability. She wasn't following the expected path. She wasn't trying to imitate anyone. She was carving her own way forward, and the palace wasn't prepared for someone who didn't play by its rules. Late one evening, when the palace fell into its quiet, rhythmic stillness, Hurrem paused in a dim passageway that overlooked the gardens. The lamps flickered along the walls, casting drifting shadows across the stone. She watched the wind move through the trees below and realized something with startling clarity. She no longer felt like a captive. The palace had tried to shape her, contain her, silence her, and yet here she was, standing firmly in a place she was never meant to reach. But while her confidence grew, the palace tightened its gaze. Mahidevran had begun forming subtle alliances, calling upon loyalty she believed still existed. She instructed her attendants with care, analyzing every movement Hurrem made. She understood the danger long before others acknowledged it. Hurrem wasn't just rising, she was shifting the center of gravity. And if Mahidevran didn't push back, she risked losing not just favor, but her entire legacy. Yet even she sensed a truth she did not want to face. Hurrem's presence near Suleiman was no longer a matter of preference. It was becoming a matter of influence. An influence inside an empire had the power to reshape everything, from political strategies to the future heirs of the dynasty. As days passed, Hurrem sensed the silent pressure building around her. Every corridor felt heavier. Every whisper carried further. Every decision she made was being watched, interpreted, questioned. But she didn't hesitate. She didn't retreat. She simply kept moving forward, step by step, choice by choice, toward a destiny no one expected her to claim. The palace had thrown its walls around her, believing it could limit her future. But instead, those walls had created something else. A forge. And inside that forge, Hurrem was becoming someone the empire would eventually fear, respect, or both, because the girl who arrived as a captive was now standing at the edge of becoming a force the Ottoman Empire had never seen before, and soon, her rise would no longer be a whisper, it would be a revolution.